Well, welcome to a tasting of a Chilean wine, an Argentinian wine, and a South African wine. At the lower priced area of wine exported all around the world, that's commonly available in such a wide number of countries around the world. These three countries would be seen as the main competitor to Australia. And in a moment, I'm going to show you some statistics, but all three countries are very similar in size to Australian production, all a little smaller than Australia. At one time, Argentina was larger, but Argentina has trimmed its wine production volumes over recent years because they were making a lot of wine that was not wanted. It was some high volume, cheap stuff. So they've restricted their wine making a bit to try and make wine that people do want. The same story exists in South Africa. So if you see the wine statistics going back about 10 years ago, which would tend to be the statistics that you'd see in a published book, that is wine statistics around about 2010, 11, 12, they're a fair bit different to currently. I went and did a fair bit of internet research stuff. And in any event, the Australian Wine Australia publishes statistics that they get up to date of competitors to Australia. Interestingly, back in 2010, the Mendoza region in Argentina produced more wine than Australia and New Zealand combined. But Mendoza has reduced its output, and meanwhile Australia and New Zealand, but particularly Australia, have surged ahead in volume. So the game's changed a bit. But certainly the tasting today is of three countries that wherever you travel in the world would be considered countries that have been making wine for a long, long time, but countries that got with the technical age and make very affordable, good wines that are in widely available in high volumes. And that's the story. When Australian wine was banned from, or effectively banned from China, the country that was first able to jump in and fill the hole was Chile. And South Africa and Argentina are vying also for the role of being able to supply generous red wines at an affordable price to the Chinese, because that's what the Chinese population, that's what they like. And we've actually got some examples to taste tonight of the wine. Let's have a quick taste of the wines, and then I'll jump over to some maps and diagrams that I have to show you. So I've got the first one here, which is the Chilean, the Carmenere. And here we are. Carmenere is originally a Bordeaux variety, which there's almost none in Bordeaux. There's a little bit in the Dordogne and regions to the south of Bordeaux, but originally it was in the Bordeaux region. There are a fair few troubles in Bordeaux with its being prone to disease and its ability to get ripe, because Bordeaux, even though it's in a fairly southerly region in France, Bordeaux's on the Atlantic coast, and the Atlantic Ocean there is pretty cold. And so Bordeaux rates as a fairly cool, cold place, and they do get rain at inconvenient times of the year as well. So Bordeaux has struggled a bit over the centuries with ripening and bad weather. Global warming may be changing that, well, is changing that. But certainly Bordeaux struggled, and in some of the lesser years, the main grapes of Bordeaux being Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Cabernet Franc, they struggle to ripen. And in a bad year, they can not really ripen at all. So Carmenere is a grape that is not a great easy ripener. So that was why it kind of faded out in Bordeaux. But when in in Chile, the Chile wine industry got established a long time ago. I'll come to this in a moment, when the Spanish first arrived there, and various grapes got planted. The French came soon after the Spanish and put the French varieties in. And one of the things about Chile to this day is the fact that there's some pretty good regions for growing grapes, and the labour costs are very low. So to make wine there, to make accessible wine is relatively easy and relatively cheap to do. And they didn't know they had Carmenere. They had this variety, it had various names, but when the DNA testing sort of came along about 8 or 9, 10 years ago, they suddenly realised that this variety that widely planted in Chile is Carmenere. And so what the Chileans have attempted to do, because there's also so much Cabernet and so much Merlot and so much Cabernet Franc, there's a bit of Syrah as well. The Chileans have kind of made Carmenere their national variety. That's their champion, because they're really the only country now in the world that's got substantial plantings of it. So here we are. It's always got a good deep reddish colour, not too dark. When you stick your nose in that, you can see that it has the slight red cherry, black cherry, tobacco leaf, little bit of the black curranty aromas. It's not dissimilar to Merlot. You know, it's in that general family of wine flavours. And this particular one has got that slight green olive herbal edge to it, which is something that you do commonly see in Chile. And there's a slight, herbs. There's a herbs aroma, which is where that means part of the crop just didn't ripen properly. And it probably shaded canopy, which means the sun didn't get into the grapes. So the grapes got to sugar level okay, but they didn't get the full ripening of the flavours there. You know, I've mentioned before, we've done these sessions that ripening of grapes consists of 2 processes in parallel. The 2 processes are connected, but they operate differently. One is the accumulation of sugar, and the other is the accumulation and the ripening of the flavours. And there's ideal ranges of temperature that those 2 processes occur at. And it varies a bit from variety to variety. The perfect growing season is when the range of temperature is in the area where both processes can go forward together. So you get a ripening of sugar with an accumulation of flavour all happening well. The accumulation of flavour temperature range is a little cooler than the range that you have of temperature for the sugar ripening. So if you get a warm vintage, you'll have sugar ripening occurring, but you won't have the flavour accumulation occurring. And in fact, sometimes the flavour accumulation can be very slow indeed, but the sugar ripening races ahead. And the wine producers forced to harvest the grapes because the sugar's getting pretty high. Don't forget, sugar just transitions to alcohol. So if you're looking at grapes that are heading to 14 and 14.5 and maybe 15 Beaumet, that is the sugar level, then that's going to transition to 14.5%, 15% alcohol. And one of the problems of warmer climates all around the world is that that happens, yet the flavours haven't accumulated so well. The other thing that can occur is that if the grapes don't get sunlight on them, they don't have a hormone stimulation in the vine that makes the flavours evolve and change. And so if you can get ripening of flavours, but if it's not done with the sunlight hormone stimulation, these green flavours accumulate. And the main compound produced is called dimethyl sulfide, DMS it's known as in the wine trade widely. And Coonawarra, for example, suffered under a lot of DMS production when they tried to go with machine pruning and minimal pruning because they couldn't get labour down, because Coonawarra is very isolated. And so if you get a lot of growth of the canopy and it shades the berries, the fruit, you can get ripening okay, but you get this greenness in the ripening. in Chile and Argentina and South Africa, a lack of skilled labour in the vineyards has meant that there have been efforts, in the last few decades, a lot of machine pruning, a lot of machine harvesting. And so those countries have struggled a bit with good all-round ripening. Now it's changing in recent years because particularly Chile's been able to climb up in its average price that it's been fetching in the market. So when you get a better price, you can actually afford to bring in more skilled labour. So of the three countries that's probably surging ahead the best, it would be Chile. Having said that, a lot of Chilean wine still struggles with ripening issues, and you do see a fair bit of this very acceptable, very enjoyable red wine, but on the edge of it, there's that slightly herbal, hard aroma on it. And you can probably all see the green olive herb aroma on the edge and quite a savoury taste. That green olive character sort of comes through to the taste where there's a slightly savoury, hard acidity edge on it. It's pretty, the wine's overall pretty good. And, you know, with some, you know, savoury foods and so on, it'll be fine. But you can just see that edge of that flavour. Now, the Carmenere gives you a fairly silky palate feel, which is pretty good. I went to a seminar a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit, on Chilean wine from a Chilean winemaking expert. And the seminar was in Adelaide. And this Chilean expert was at great pains to point out that the typical reputation of Chilean wine, namely of what we have on the table now, they're trying to improve that. So there's been a lot of work where they've changed viticultural methods for Carmenere, and they've got better labour in vineyards, and they're finding if they can get more developed ripeness to it, they can eliminate that green herbal edge character, and that's the big welcome trend that's occurring in Chile. Those sorts of wines really at the moment aren't found outside Chile, but anyway, it's happening. So some of these brands from Chile are very high volume. So you know, there's a lot of these sorts of wines around the world, and this particular brand is a fairly big producer. You know, there's the Carmenere. The next one.
I have a question about the ripening of fruit. Are there techniques they can use, say, in a winery, maybe to do with skin contact, that might actually replace some of that, or some of what hasn't occurred in the ripening process? Yeah,
good question. The answer is no. So if you've got unripe fruit, and of course the green olive herbal character is tied up in the skins, if you do more skin contact, you'll actually accentuate it. Yeah, so that's one of the issues. It's you know, one of the great truths of winemaking is that it's very hard to get around lesser or poor raw material. Very hard. You know, you can play a bit. I mean, the classic way to do it is pressings and sweetness, blending. You know, if you can get a really ripe grape concentrates and add them in, you can, to a certain extent, neutralise the greenness. You can leave a bit of residual sweetness deliberately. But of course, winemakers or wine judges, sorry, and you know, and experienced consumers can pick that up. So it's very hard to get around if your raw material is just not in balance and ripe. Yeah, definitely. Be interesting for you because you'll see a lot of batches coming through in that winemaking facility in the Adelaide Hills, and they'll have stuff there that's not quite ripe. Be interesting for you to ask, you know, whoever the GD winemaker is, when you get some, you know, green fruit, or, you know, okay, right, you know, it's up to Beaumet, but it's not, but there's DM, remember the name DMS. If there's DMSy but otherwise ripe fruit, I'd like you to show me some. And they'll have no problem. They'll have it there, and when you stick your nose in it, you'll see straight away how savoury and how it is. Coonawarra managed to largely eliminate that that issue that they had for nearly 2 decades. You still get the odd bit of, stemmy green olive character, but Coonawarra seems to have got around that. And I'll come back and I'll show you the map. So let's just go to the wine. So next wine is the Argentinian Malbec. Again, just like Carmenere, Malbec has been the grape that the Argentinians have, taken on as their national wine, if you like, their champion red, which they export a lot. And the interesting thing about Malbec, of course, is Malbec ripens pretty easily in a range of climates. It has fantastic colour, very deep, and Malbec, it ripens much more readily than Carmenere. And Malbec gives you a generosity and a depth of flavour, which is, so here, the thing about a Malbec, when it's pretty ripe, you tend to get ripe plum and you get fruitcake type aromas. And if you stick your nose in this one, you can see there's definitely the fruitcake. It's a very generous, rich style red. On the palate, it's got, you can see it's silky, it's generous, it's got quite a bit of flavour. It's fading away now, so the persistence is 3, 4, 5 seconds, which is okay. For such a big red, probably doesn't have the persistence you'd expect of a super premium one, but it's all round pretty good drinking. And the Argentinians traditionally love this style of red with their very beef-dominated food. There's an Argentinian print just behind me on the wall of a gaucho, yeah. And it's a print that my wife bought in Buenos Aires, there we are. And so anyway, the meat dishes and all the various things with the reds is a real Argentinian thing. And full-bodied but silky, rich reds are very popular, and Argentina does it very well with the Malbec. In Australia, we have a lot of Malbec as well. Normally, Malbec's regarded as a bit of a blender because it gives colour and depth and so on, so it's really good. Malbec on its own can be rich and full, but a bit simple. It can lack subtlety and texture. This one's good. This is one of the better Malbecs. So I think Australian Malbec is probably not as interesting as this one. This wine's got richness, but it's got some silky drinkability about it. A lot of Australian Malbecs can be too fruitcakey. You'll be seeing Malbec, David, as well, up there, blasting in off the Barossa floor in Renmark, I would think.
Yeah, they're talking about Langhorne Creek maybe 20 years becoming a Malbec area as opposed to a Cab Sav.
Yeah. So Malbec's in the same family. And there is a bit of Malbec still in Bordeaux, not much. Malbec grown there because it can add colour and flavour. Malbec is one of the official varieties. You're allowed to use it in Bordeaux. In practice, there's not a lot there anymore, and not many people are using it, but there are pockets of Malbec, and it's prized for its easy ripeness and richness of flavour. Let's just trot along to the third one, then I'll drop back and show you some of the origins and so on. So this is Pinotage. This is an interesting story. So Pinotage is a hybrid. It's a cross of Pinot Noir and Cinsault. Everyone knows Pinot Noir, Burgundy grape. Cinsault is a red grape from the, it's grown in 2 main areas, but it's from the south of France. So it's a, Cinsault is a warm climate, dark coloured, full-bodied red grown in warmer climates. So Cinsault is grown around the south of France in Languedoc and across to the southern Rhone. And so Cinsault is actually one of the varieties you do see popping up in southern Rhone blends. The other place that Cinsault grows is in Spain, and you see it there in various regions. I guess the main region that would have it as a premium wine is Priorat, the district up in the mountains in behind Barcelona. So, but a couple of centuries ago, the South Africans developed this hybrid, and so you had the fussy, thin-skinned, delicate aromatics of Pinot Noir with the full-bodied, thick-skinned, dark-coloured, disease-resistant, made for hot climates Cinsault. So it's actually probably a pretty good hybrid marriage, really. And so that's the result was the grape that the South Africans call Pinotage. There's a bit of Pinotage in Australia. It could be pretty successful. Mark Ravenscroft, who's a South African guy originally, who is the winemaker and was the owner at Ravenscroft Wines up on the Granite Belt, has a Pinotage, and his Pinotage is gorgeous. It's more like a Pinot Noir than a Cinsault. The one we have in front of us is a bit of both. You can see, I mean, some of the colours a bit on the lighter red side. It does have a touch of that light red cherry aroma, but on the palate, that Pinot Noir silky thing is not really there. Oh, you've got it there. Yeah, a good idea, Meredith. It's good, isn't it? I've got some of that. I reckon that Ravenscroft Pinotage is probably better than the South African one we've got in front of us. Anyway, so this wine, you can see it's got quite a bit of tannin. This wine's got a lightness, and there's a bit of that elegant aroma, and it's a little bit juicy. And it's got quite a lot of tannin. That's that. Think of a cup of tea made with 2 tea bags. That furry round the mouth dryness. But with the charcuterie and the smoked foods and the meats and so on, that'd be pretty good. So there's a lot of Pinotage in South Africa, and it's South Africa's, well, it's probably the champion variety. There's also a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon in South Africa traditionally as well. And in a moment, I'm going to take you and show you some maps. South Africa is has been going through for a decade or more this sort of Jekyll and Hyde, Arthur or Martha story, and what are they going to do? So, I think I'll go to the maps and I'll show you. So I'm just going to do my share the screen, and I will show you what we have here. So yeah, everyone's seen that photo with the snow and the cloud on the hills behind in Chile. Okay, so there's Chile. So the little bit of map on the left shows you all that part of South America, and the Chilean wine regions are in this middle bit here. If you were to look at the longitude of the wine regions line up with southern France and northern Africa and the Mediterranean. But because the ocean is so cold here, and because the vineyards are even though they're close to the coast, they're very high altitudes. Chile is considered overall pretty much a cold region, and some areas are very cold indeed. Obviously, the further north you go, the warmer you get. But the main Chilean premium regions are these middle bits here, and you'll probably recognise some of the names: Casablanca Valley, and these sort of areas through the middle here, and quite high climates, high altitudes. 1,000 metres is not uncommon for all these regions here. And now the granite belt's 1,000 metres, and it's considered pretty high by Australian standards. So that's what you get in Chile. A couple of interesting statistics about it. So 16th century is when the grapes were planted, but the French came along soon after. And so the main varieties are Cabernet, Merlot and Carmenere. And the annual volume is only a little bit behind Australia. Now, having said that, the vast majority of Chilean wine is lower priced, whereas Australia spreads out more evenly across the price points. So we've got a lot more wine selling in the middle and higher price brackets. Chile doesn't have that. If we go to Argentina, well, there's the Chile area we just talked about. So we're now still on the other side of the Andes and still very high altitudes. and or a long way inland now, of course, coming in from the east coast. Now, Mendoza, that region there where my mouse is hovering, Mendoza accounts for 50% or more of Argentinian wine. So even though the other areas on the map are drawn to a similar size, Mendoza is huge. And I mentioned earlier on that back 10 years ago, Mendoza produced more wine than Australia and New Zealand did combined, but that's changed a lot. What had occurred is that there were all sorts of economic problems in Argentina, and for some years there, when the generals had taken over, they had rampant inflation, and a lot of wine was produced, and there were a lot of government subsidies. A lot of wine was turned into distilling products and all that sort of thing. So there was an emphasis in Argentina on volume, producing volume, and there wasn't much quality. But eventually the country has, over the last 20 years, has phased out subsidies to agriculture, and wines had its subsidies reduced and removed, and Argentina has reduced its grape growing and wine production by volume accordingly. And Argentina's turned into a country that is trying to export a very drinkable, fairly premium wine, but they have very low production costs, so they can do it quite cheaply. So you can see there in Mendoza, the grapes there, Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, and others. There's also quite a bit of Chardonnay. And when you start talking about Chardonnay in Australia, and there's the talk of the clones and whatever, Australia happens to have a very large amount of Chardonnay growing, which came off the Mendoza clone, as it was known. So it was a French Burgundy clone taken to Argentina, propagated, and then the cuttings came to Australia from there, and it's known as the Mendoza clone. And a lot of Mendoza clone Chardonnay is in Australia. So there's Argentina, and a few statistics. Fifth largest producer, 850 million. Remember, we're 1.4 at the moment, so Australia's significantly bigger. Very Spanish with the colonisation. And Mendoza province is more than half of all the wine. Interestingly, there's quite a lot of indigenous white variety, or Spanish, but now indigenous to Argentina, called Torrontés. And that's why I'm glad I'm a Master of Wine. I don't have to do the exams now, because I see Torrontés pops up in Master of Wine exam tastings. How you'd recognise a Torrontés white, I'm not sure anymore. Meredith, you'll have to study that and tell us all how you recognise a Torrontés. I have tasted it. I think the good way to recognise Torrontés would be to look at the label on the bottle. That's what I would have to do, I think. So you can see Malbec, Torrontés, Cabernet, Syrah, and Chardonnay. So, interesting. Probably a bit more diversity in Argentina than in Chile, but it's a big producer. On to South Africa, and interesting history and geography here. So there's Cape Town. And of course, most of the wine regions are hugging the coast around the south here. Now, traditionally, the areas that were where a lot of grapes were grown were these slightly inland regions, particularly Stellenbosch, which is that bit just inland from Cape Town. And once you go a little bit inland, it gets hot very quickly. So Paarl is another region. Historically, Constantia itself was sort of just out of Cape Town and was, one of the world's most desirable wines in the 1700s was Constantia, and they still produce wine. It's one of the great wine estates of the world. They're famous for making a Tritus dessert wine style. In more recent times, there have been lots of plantings of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and the more modern, trendy varieties down around this crescent around the east coast here. And Hermanus, see just there, is sort of the centre of this new area of cold climate South African winemaking. In the areas here, the Stellenbosch and Paarl areas, which are flat, hot plains with high volumes, There were a lot of cooperatives, a lot of worker cooperatives, and at one stage there, going back to the early 1900s, one of the cooperatives there, that's got a long Dutch name, but it is known as the KWV, was appointed by the South African government to oversee the regulations of South African wine. And so what they did was to bring in regulations that that encouraged high volumes in hot regions. And so Cabernet, Cabernet Blend, Pinotage, and so on. And in the 1980s, when some of the newer, younger producers started to do Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, they couldn't get the subsidies and the government assistance that was around at the time for the wine trade, for the wine industry. Now, all that's fallen apart in more recent years because South Africa just doesn't have the financial ability to prop up agriculture like it used to do. And of course, the other thing was the wine growing in the central hotter areas here were dominated by the Dutch Boers traditionally, and of course they lost power when South Africa transitioned away from the apartheid arrangements. So today you've got this sort of slight rejuvenation of these inland high volume areas, but a lot of excitement in premium wine circles, particularly in export of these sort of newer and more international modern wines being produced along the coast here. And so if you sort of look at where a lot of South African wine is exported to the UK, you'll go to a high street discount wine shop and the wines will be inexpensive and from the inland regions, and the wines won't be that great. And then you'll go to an upmarket wine shop or an upmarket wine bar or restaurant and they'll have a few South African wines, and all the wines will be expensive and super premium, and they'll be Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays, and they'll all be from this region down here. So quite a sort of a change. South Africa's had a lot of trouble with technical expertise in these inland regions. Having the labour to be able to look after the wines has been difficult. The leaf roll virus got in there in a big way and is still a problem that they're trying to deal with. I'll show you a couple of statistics here. South Africa goes back to 1659, so much older than Australia, about 1 billion litres, a lot of it at that low end though, compared to our 1.5 billion. There are the grapes. So the South Africa makes a very high amount of white wine, which we call Chenin Blanc. And in fact, the world knows as Chenin Blanc, but the South Africans give it the name Steen, S-T-E-E-N. And if you go to a wine bar in London and it's a cheap wine bar and you want the cheapest dry house white wine, it'll be South African Chenin Blanc, probably out of a cask. There's vast quantities of it made, and even the South African premium producers sort of laugh about it. There's also a lot of Colombard. Colombard is a white variety that on a good day tastes like water. And so, you get these blends of these sort of high volume, cheap light whites. Quite a bit of Sauvignon Blanc. South African Sauvignon Blancs around and pretty well known. Even though Pinotage is sort of its adopted national red variety, it's not as high as the others. And there's a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon. But South African Cabernet Sauvignon really varies. I've had a bit over the years, and some of them are pretty good. Not many. I mean, I'm generalising, but a lot of South African Sauvignon Blanc has that same DMS ripeness issue, and so it can be tricky. They're the wines we're doing tonight in the order we're doing them. So just so you can see there. So in summary, you're dealing with 3 countries that have volumes not dissimilar to Australia, a bit lower. They probably haven't had the technical prowess that Australia's had. There's no question Australia for decades and decades and decades, has been one of the world leaders in technical innovations. But both, all three of Chile, Argentina, and South Africa, mainly Chile and Argentina, followed a similar path through Australia. They had a lot of traditional winemaking, which was aimed at ripe, fuller flavoured wines. And then in 1980s, in came the inexpensive equipment and the technical prowess to enable you to make high quality premium wines inexpensively. Mainly the cheap refrigeration, the cheap cooling of stainless steel tanks, which enabled warm areas to be able to slow down and control the fermentations and produce lower alcohol, fruity wines and get them into bottle nice and fresh. And Australia went there substantially, so did New Zealand. Took a bit longer, but Chile went there after. They were the next one. And then Argentina is doing it at the moment. South Africa is a two-stage industry. The area on the coast is very modern. The inland bit's very old-fashioned and struggles a bit. So it's an interesting comparisons. Yeah, to the aging, that'd be one of those things. I think the law will obviously soften a bit over a couple of years. I think the Carmenere that we have here will really never lose that green herb aroma. And as I come back to it, I'm, it's not exactly my cup of tea, that greenness. So I think that's hard work. So with some bottle aging, that won't go away. So I think that's the issue there. I think the Malbec, the thing about the Malbec is that it's very generous and it's very easy to drink and it's rich and round. And the nice thing about those Malbecs is that lovely big fruitcakey thing. Yeah, that's good. He's a very good taster, Colin. Yeah. So the Malbec's got that lovely generous fruitcakiness, and with a bit of age, that I think that fruitcake thing could increase, but the fruitiness and the refreshment in that wine would subside. So I don't reckon that's a great aging proposition either, in my view. The wine's very soft. It's got a softness already. For 2019, that's okay. Now the Pinotage is 2015, so it's substantially older. Nice aroma. You could be forgiven for thinking that was a village level cold year, lesser Burgundy. It's got some lightness of the red cherry, a little bit of silkiness. It's quite acidic, and it's got an astringency to it. Anyway, it's Pinotage. It's not bad. It's actually Stellenbosch, so which is the inland warm area, and it's 13.5%. So it's very acidic and very savoury, even though it's a warm area and it's pretty high in alcohol. So anyway, interesting wine. I think the Pinotage might be nice to go another couple of years, although it's already, it's 7 years old now. So there we are. But it's interesting wine. Certainly Pinotage varies a fair bit. You do see some very ripe examples which have got more in the Cinsault sort of flavour than the Pinot. And then you see examples like this sort of quite in the Pinot style. The other thing that happens is that a lot of the fairly traditional Pinotages from South Africa have a cindery aroma, cinders, when you get the bits of cinders flying out of the fire. And when you taste them, you often get this slight tannic, smoky, cindery aftertaste, which has been known as a bit of a criticism of Pinotage. But this wine doesn't have it. This is a pretty clean, pretty good example, but quite savoury style. So very interesting wine. So that's a bit of a roundup. Now, I guess I conclude with these wines by saying that what we have here are 3 wines that are very middle of the road, very affordable, very high volume, and from very large producers. So if you were sitting in some neutral country in the world and somebody like me put on a bit of a tasting and there was an Australian wine, and a French wine and a New Zealand wine or a Chilean wine or something like that, and the Australian wine was, say, Wolf Blass red label, which you can buy in a Dan Murphy for about $12, which is it's a Barossa Riverland blended Shiraz, which Wolf Blass makes probably about 400,000 cases of a year. Now I tell you a wine that would be you'd see in international tasting. If you wanted a lower priced Australian wine at an international tasting, a wine that you'd get really easily all over the world, the wine would be Yellowtail Shiraz or Yellowtail Cabernet. Now imagine with the knowledge that we all have, and you go to a tasting, in somewhere in the world, it could be even in the UK, but let's suppose against some country that's not that well known for wine knowledge, and they put on this tasting of comparison of countries, and the wine from Australia is Yellowtail. Now, Yellowtail is very well made. It's very drinkable, but it doesn't set the world alight or anything like that. I think these 3 wines are that sort of thing. They're very well made. They're very representative. They're from the affordable part of the wines that you get in the country. So I can see all the votes. I think the Malbec is good. I think I'd probably be voting. My vote would probably be the Malbec. But they're all pretty interesting. Okay, any comments or questions on those wines? I'm drinking my Malbec.
Andrew, the high-end market in these countries is probably coming. I mean, it obviously exists, probably in small volume, but it would still be coming. I would think the South Americans, who are probably they're really second world countries, and they're probably, improving economically, etc., will probably develop that high-end wine over time, because they've gone from that enormous volume to more concentrated and controlled volumes. Is that likely to occur?
Yeah, well, in fact, probably it has occurred to some extent already. The problem is it's very hard to get the wines. Now, Chile's certainly got some really high-end stuff now. They do Pinot Noir, they do Carmenere, and they do Cabernet. And I happened to go to this tasting, which was put on for the Australian wine industry in Adelaide, where they brought the wines in, and we saw some pretty smart wine, but the wines are not available outside Chile. So it's definitely happening. Interestingly, in Argentina, all the First Growth Bordeaux owners are all doing joint ventures. I've been doing joint ventures there for decades. And the wine seems to go back for sale in small quantities into a particular premium part of the French consumer market. So, Chateau Margaux, Lafite, Margaux Rothschild's got a really big operation there. Martin Chandon's got an Argentinian sparkling wine, big, high volume, which you see that in the UK, actually. So there have been some really big joint ventures with very prestigious producers going into Argentina. And, those wines you just don't see in Australia. And I go looking for things like that occasionally when I'm in the UK. You don't see much of it. So I don't know where it all goes, but yes, there are small volumes of super high end. Now you can get high end South African a little bit in Australia. And in fact, Wine Experience at Rosalie, where we're getting these wines from for our tasting, has a little bit of high end South African from time to time. They're quite expensive. In fact, you can get Constantia there, the dessert wine. and they have the Hamilton Russell. Hamilton Russell sort of occupies the position that Gioconda occupies in Australia. You know, a small, not too small, but very boutiquey, very expensive, really well known for super premium Chardonnays and super premium Pinot Noir. And the Hamilton Russell wines are sold in some super premium retail outlets in London. And you do see a little bit in Australia. Now, when I've seen the wines, in fact, I bought some Hamilton Russell Chardonnay and Pinot Noir from Wine Experience, and I tried them out, and they were, you know, not dissimilar at all to, Adelaide Hills Chardonnay, and I guess, you know, Mornington Peninsula, you know, really upmarket Pinot Noirs. They're very much in that international style, and they didn't look South African at all. They look like New World, modern super dupers. So all three countries are certainly doing the high end. We just don't really see them in Australia. And I don't know where they, I do know, reading the stuff today, when I was doing some research, that upmarket Chilean and upmarket Argentinian wines do go to the US. And there are Italian distributors involved with the Argentina, which means they tend to go to the East Coast. And there are Spanish distributors involved with Chile, which means they tend to go to the West Coast of the US. So it is happening a bit. Yeah. But they're certainly different to Australia. You know, they're certainly different to that Australian style that we typically see at the same price points, I guess. An interesting point that one of the wine trade guys was telling me the other day, that I was talking to, a South Australian guy. He said, when you taste the price point, he knew this tasting was on tonight that I was doing. He said, when you do the price point of these wines and you do the equivalent price point of Australian wine, there's something about the clean but silky, fleshy generosity of an Australian wine, but it's still got freshness. Whereas in the Chilean, Argentinian and South African wines, they've got a lot of flavour, they've got some big palate. There's usually something murky going on as well, to a degree. You know, there's a tannin element, or there's a cindery, sulphidey element, or there's a bit of, you know, they just don't have the overall generosity. And he was pointing out to me that one of the big disasters that's really been so unfortunate is that the Chinese population had worked out, tasting all these wines, that just from their taste, they liked Australian wine. There was something about the generous and rounded silkiness of Australian wine that they liked. And no wonder we were selling so much wine in China. Now the Chinese people who are used to buying that wine have got to buy Chilean, Argentinian and South African, and they're not as happy. They'll still do it, but they're not as happy. So it's just the way the politics have gone. So, got another question? Meredith, what do you think? You've got the technical tasting going on here. You're the one who got to do the exams. What do you think about these wines?
Yeah, the Pinotage wasn't as expected as the typical style that I was normally expecting. When I've had them before, I usually pick up a lot of coffee.
Yep.
And we had the one from Ravenscroft last weekend when we were up there, and really enjoyed it and bought a few bottles back.
Yep. I think this particular Pinotage tonight's got more in common with the Pinot, whereas the coffee taste, of course, is the Tinso. That's the Tinso ripeness and the super ripeness character. You know, you get that mocha coffee flavour, especially when there's a bit of oak on it.
Yeah. And Colin, his choice was the Malbec as well as mine. He doesn't like that. That I pick up a lot of capsicum, but he said, no, it's like an olive leaf crossed with a blackberry bush and black currant bush.
Yeah, it is. There's a definite thing there, isn't it? Yeah. It is, yeah. What do you think, Maria? You enjoying these? These you probably don't, none of us would be really seeing too much Chilean or Argentinian or South African wine day to day.
No, they're quite unfamiliar, but appreciating your critique of them. The South African one, my first impression was firecracker and smokiness that you that you pointed out. Now, what was the cause? What was contributing to that?
Well, the cinders taste. It just seems to be something that pops up in Pinotage. Yeah, I don't know where it comes from. It is from a master of wine who's an expert in South Africa that I did a seminar with some years ago. It's widespread. It's widespread on South African Pinotage, this slightly cinders character. And I just don't know where it comes from. It's intriguing. Yeah, it's interesting that you see it so readily. So
that was my first sensation. Mm.
Yep.
Yeah, but enjoyed them all, and probably preferred the Argentinian.
Yeah, that's good. Well, the wines will all last for tomorrow night and the night after. So you'll have to, Paul, you go out and kill a cow and sort of put it on the barbecue, won't you? To go with the we're going to come to Frederick's recipe in a moment, but that's probably what you'd be looking to do. Put the big beef dishes. That's what certainly is. That's right. No. Do you have a preference for these sorts of wines? You travel a lot. You'd probably see some of these things in some of the travels you do internationally. You'd see these things.
Yeah, definitely. I guess historically I preferred Chilean. I really like Senna, which is a more a Cab Sav in the Chilean. But of these three, I agree. I like the Argentinian. It's actually interesting. I find it interesting tasting it, over the hour as well. I mean, it's the South African I actually put third. I would have gone the Argentinian, the Chilean, the South African. But it's actually growing on me as I taste. As you go back and taste it, the South African is actually growing on me. Yep. So I don't know whether it just needed a bit to be open a bit more, or something like that. But it's actually, I always find it interesting the way things change as you taste them through the tasting, or have a second go as well.
Yep.
But, no, three good selections.
It's an interesting comment that you make there, because that's an interesting one on the how wines appear to develop. There's been some interesting tasting research done on that, and what actually happens is the wines don't develop. What happens is that your taste perception kind of moves a bit, and you either condition your palate a bit, or what happens is that some wines have got this good fundamental balance. They've actually got good flavours, but there's a bit of subtlety going on, and as you sort of condition your taste a bit, you start to see that you sort of come to this more subtle balance that's pleasing. And it's that's why they say, unless you're a very experienced judge, it's very hard to tell that at a simple sip. You've got to come back and look at a wine 5 and 10 minutes later, which obviously, if you've got a lot of wines to taste, is very impractical and difficult to do. But yeah, I find that wines just seem to be available. Some wines just look better later. There's no question. Some wines look better the following night. It's amazing how you just sort of come to it,
Yeah.
Anyway, the research says they don't really change. You do, but anyway, it's interesting about that. I think the wines that are the upfront hit you in the face are the ones probably to be a bit suspicious of, which is, of course, how we mostly drink wine, of course. But yeah, it's interesting all the way the different tasting.
It's interesting. I know we talked about this the other time as well. Like the Argentinian and the Chilean were corked as well. Is that just reflective of the market they're trying to attract?
Yeah, I think very much their export market. These wines are probably pretty much going to China, and some of us gone sideways to Australia. And the Chinese market demands a cork. They won't come at screw cap. They want that traditional thing. The Americans are very similar. So I think most Chilean and Argentinian wine would be would have a cork in it. Interesting, when I got those Hamilton Russell wines to try, which are very expensive, from the South African wines, the ones I got were screw caps. So they're obviously doing a bit of both. So yeah, it's interesting what they do. Okay, Frederick, I think we need to have a your European take on these wines, but also where you think the rest, the food matching would work in with these.
Yeah. So all three wines and, well, all three countries in terms of wines don't have the best reputation in Europe, right? So there's this thing about Chile and South Africa and also Argentina that most people would say, well, these are not the best wines, although probably the Malbec has the best reputation. And I found the Malbec best, and you like the South African best. And actually, I should be honest, what Paul was saying, and what you were saying, Andrew, is that the Pinotage grows on you and becomes a bit better, actually becomes better, and I like that. Now, in terms of a dish to go with it, it's a bit unfair, of course, because Australia is the barbecue place, right? So what you said, kill a cow, I think that's sort of it. And I love this, of course. So my grandfather was a butcher. So I've been brought up with all sorts of beef and lamb, and I love this. But it probably requires an open fire and a wood fire. And I had a PhD student, and he moved to Argentina, and he told me about asado. And asado is more like it's not just a barbecue, it's an open fire, it's a social event that goes on for hours, and you put on all sorts of meat, right, from beef to lamb chops and everything, and that you combine with the Malbec that flows abundantly throughout the whole night. And so that would probably be my my recommendation here is a whole night of all sorts of meat dishes above an open fire with the Malbec. I think that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, Barbara's sitting off the camera, but Barbara spent a bit of time in Argentina and has actually been to one of those, or several of those beef festivals. She's yelling out in the background about, and you get all the different beef cuts, including the offal. You know, you get the and with the big reds. Yeah, that'd be. That would be a good place for Malbec, I agree. What's the expression, I know you're Belgian, but in French, what would you say for kill a cow, as in for the barbecue?
I don't know if we would have an expression for that. That's a good question. Let me think about that.
I'll have to email it off to French MWs and say this is what we.
I think it's a bit brutal for the French.
Yes, that's right. They might be in shock at the lack of elegance about preparing the food. Yeah, that's right. Okay, now Laura and I are going to confer and organise. We've got a couple of topics lined up for next month already. And we'll send you the dates. We'll do the later Sunday evenings in the month. We figured we go to back to some classical wine appreciation type topics, and so we'll just refine those topics and let you know. And we'll see if we can jump a bit harder on wine experience. The guy who did all the stuff at Wine Experience actually had an issue and had to go away for a while, and he's back now, but it was a real problem. It affected us getting the wine selections and getting the wines out to you all. So we're going to try and see them this week and get around that, and so that at least the practicalities of getting the wine is done much more easily. But if you have any suggestions for topics, send them in. I think we've got March figured, but very interested on any ideas that you've got, and we'll can work around that and figure out the tasting to suit. So there's Laura moving her camera around. So we got the topics, haven't we? We'll get sorted.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, please do send us suggestions, and I think this year is the best year to be getting out of the box a bit and trying things we've never tried before. I mean, California was a start. This is fantastic, but the distribution of wines for other countries other than just France, Italy and New Zealand is getting a lot better. I know for a fact that there was a huge shipment of Californian wines just a few weeks ago, California had an amazing vintage last year, and there's so much to explore. We can explore Sonoma, which is a different microclimate to the Napa. So let's try something different. Let's go interesting. So please send us your suggestions about some far-flung country, and we'll see what we can do to try something a bit different.
Good. I actually spoke to Paul just last night about another theme, which we've sort of explored before, but one of the themes for March is that there's this diversity that's occurring in Australian Shiraz. A lot of people don't really realise it, and I saw it. It was a bit difficult to do wine shows last year because of COVID, but I did do the Australian Small Winemakers Wine Show where it really came up. You get this, I guess you'd call it the traditional style of Shiraz, which most people think is what Australian Shiraz is, namely the, Barossa Valley, McLaren Vale, pretty ripe with a fair bit of oak, and it's typified by the, Penfolds, Orlando, Grant Burge, Wolf Blass, those sorts of producers. And it's a fabulous style. And internationally, people know Australia for that kind of wine. But there's another style that's really come on, which mainly appeals, I think, to younger drinkers and probably to women a bit more, which is not so oaked. And it's where the Shiraz is made a bit like a Pinot, where there's a bit of whole bunch and it's a fruitier, more aromatic, less chocolatey. It's not as dry. And there's starting to be regions in Australia that seem to just do that style really, really well. And Heathcote's one of them, Heathcote in Victoria. There's quite a lot of Heathcote, and they call them Syrah to distinguish them from Shiraz. So that's one of our tastings we've got lined up in March. When you first put that kind of wine in front of a traditional Penfolds drinker, initially they're quite shocked that it's Shiraz, but like Paul mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you sort of come round to it a bit. I like both styles actually, and there's actually a movement in the Barossa Valley now where Dad might have made the very Wolf Blassy Penfoldsy style, and along comes the son or the daughter who's younger, and they're trying to do maybe a little bit of the more modern style, but still doing it in the Barossa Valley. And I've seen a few of those popping up as well, and they're interesting in themselves. So we're going to see what we can do and do some explorations of some of these new wavy Australian Shirazes that are appearing there, all very interesting. So look out for that for March. And what's that one, Hannah?
Hannah, her sister is calling in, and she's very interested in the wine tastings because she does a lot of wine tastings, and so she's sneaking in and trying to listen.
Okay, right. Well, I don't know how she's going to go picking up some of the Australian wines. I suppose you can get the Australian wine. You probably get Yellowtail, no problem. Which is all right.
Yeah, that one. It's difficult to get good Australian wines in Belgium.
Yeah.
We've tried to recommend some, but it's difficult to find good Australian wines.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it would be. There's good Australian wines pretty plentiful in Germany, especially northern Germany, but you've got to look out for them. Anyway, so that's our plan. So keep an eye on those things, send the suggestions, and we'll be back in touch. Laura and I'll be back in touch with emails and let you know about some of our themes for March and so on, and we'll get that streamlined process going from.
Was it the second and third weekend or the?
Yeah,
third,
yep. They seem to be good weekends, just in the middle there. People, last weekends and first weekends seem to have, complications. So that's our plan. So that's what we'll do. But we'll get an email out in the next few days about that. Okay, thanks, Meredith. Right, good night, all, and enjoy the cow with the Malbec, and we'll see you in a few weeks' time. Good night. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
See ya.
Thank you. Bye.